What a beautiful, beautiful afternoon out here. Can you hear the wind in the aspen leaves right now? That's just one of my favorite sounds. It's so peaceful out here. It's officially autumn. Colors are starting to change. There's that constant chill in the air, and it is just wonderful. It is so pretty out here. You know, as a wildlife photographer, I understand the difficulties that come along with this type of photography. It can be hard enough just to find an animal to photograph sometimes, and once you've found an animal to photograph, it can be difficult to get into the best position to photograph that animal. And once you're in position, that animal might step behind a tree all of a sudden that's now blocking it, or it might put its head down and now there's a bunch of grass in front of its face. There's always difficulties with this type of photography. When I first started wildlife photography, when I first started looking for animals to observe and photograph, I would find myself in these ruts. I would find myself just feeling stuck at times, not knowing what animals to go out to look for to try to photograph. There were times when I felt like there were no animals to photograph. And over the years, as I've come to learn more about animal behavior, I've been able to get around some of these ruts at times. In this week's video, I wanted to talk about some of the species that have been pretty reliable over the years. These are somewhat easy to find species that you can go out and find pretty easily and be able to photograph during all different times of the years. And I wanted to give you guys some ideas of animals that you can photograph if you're ever feeling stuck, if you're ever wondering, oh, what can I go out today to photograph? So follow along this week's video as we talk about these animals that you can go out and photograph pretty much any time during the year, any season of the year, whether it's autumn like it is now, winter, spring, summer, whatever season it is. I hope that I can give you some ideas of animals to photograph no matter what month of the year it is. With it being autumn, I thought it only logical to start with this time of year, to start by talking about some animals that you can find and photograph pretty reliably during this time of year. There's a certain group of animals in particular that I love photographing this time of year. That group being ungulates, or hoofed mammals. Animals like moose, elk, deer, bighorn sheep, these are all animals that this time of year becomes so fun to photograph. They're so busy trying to pass on their genes to create the next generation. They're so busy battling each other. The males are trying to assert dominance over each other. They're trying to impress the females, which are usually fairly unimpressed. But, you know, it's just a fun time of year to photograph this group of animals. And it's a group of animals that can actually be easier to photograph this time of year. The males are so busy battling each other, they're so preoccupied with each other that many times they're less worried about the photographer over there taking their pictures, and it can actually be easier to photograph them during this time of year. That being said, please remember to give them the space that they need, be respectful of your distance with them, and just photograph them as respectfully as possible. As wildlife photographers, we're constantly trying to come up with compelling images to look at, action-filled images, and this time of year is an amazing time of year to come up with some real compelling and just captivating images to look at, whether it's some elk sparring or bighorn sheep butting heads. There's just so many opportunities out there for us wildlife photographers. Next, let's move into winter. This is a season, this is a time of year that can be extremely difficult for wildlife photographers, and for years this was the hardest time for me to try to get wildlife images. You know, I would always make it up to Yellowstone 2 or 3 times a winter to try to photograph wildlife up there. I would backpack up into the mountains, ski into the mountains, trying to find a fox or something else to photograph. But for the most part, I just didn't know what to photograph on a day-to-day basis, and I felt stuck. For weeks at a time, I would go without photographing things, just relying on those Yellowstone trips. That was until I realized that there were so many ducks in my area. And ducks traditionally weren't, you know, a group of animals that I would photograph, but I quickly became addicted to duck photography about 2 years ago. And 2 winters ago, and then again last winter, I was able to fill so many of my days out photographing so many beautiful species of ducks. And now winter is just one of my favorite times to photograph wildlife. The cool thing about this time of year is that ducks are fairly accessible for the most part. It's a species that you could photograph potentially before work or on a lunch break or something. You don't have to go deep into the mountains. You don't have to drive out to Yellowstone or whatever it is to photograph them. They're pretty consistent in certain areas, so once you can find and identify those areas, they're going to be there pretty much every day. Another cool thing is that a lot of the ducks that you can photograph in the wintertime, these are species that have migrated in, so they're species that you're not going to be able to photograph in your area during other times of the year. So ducks are just so much fun to photograph because the species are constantly changing through different times of the year, and especially in winter, it can just be so fun to photograph them as they're these species that you haven't seen all year, and you can just get some amazing beautiful morning light with that crisp air, and they can just be so much fun to photograph. So if you're like me and you find yourself being stuck in a rut during the winter months, just not knowing what to photograph on a day-to-day basis, focus on ducks. Such a wonderful group of species that you can photograph reliably and fairly easily. Ducks are just so much fun to photograph. All right, let's move into spring. Spring can be a wildlife photographer's dream. Such a wonderful time of year for wildlife photography. You've got animals waking up that have been asleep all winter. You've got bird nests starting, baby animals starting to be born. Ducks are starting to migrate out, but you've got new species that you haven't seen for a few months migrating back in. It's just such a wonderful time of year for wildlife photography. A lot of these scenarios that I just mentioned, though, they can be very time consuming. It can be hard to find bird nests to photograph for the baby animals that are being born. They can just be very sensitive photographing those species and difficult to do on a day-to-day basis. But there is one group of animals that I love photographing each spring, and they can be quite consistent in their areas and a little bit easier to photograph. That group are grouse. The nice thing about grouse is that you can find them pretty much everywhere. There are so many different species of grouse out there. You've got dusky grouse, you've got greater sage grouse, sharp-tailed grouse, spruce grouse. There's just so many different species. That's just a few, and those are just a few in my area that I've got. But I've got such a huge long list of different grouse species worldwide that I would love to photograph. So chances are there's going to be some sort of grouse species nearby that you can photograph. And another nice thing about grouse is that each of these different species, they have a different display that they do this time of year. And it can be really fun to photograph these different species and their different displays. Another nice thing about grouse is that once you find some, they're pretty consistent generally to that area. So if you can find a species of grouse in your area, chances are that they'll be there again in the coming days or weeks or even the next year, the next spring. So grouse can be a wonderful group of animals to photograph this time of year during the spring months. Such fun and beautiful birds. You can fill up an entire spring with just grouse pretty easily and get a variety of unique species and images doing so. Summer can be another really difficult time for wildlife photography. It can just be harder to find wildlife in general. A lot of the ducks that you've been photographing for months now, they've migrated out of the area. A lot of the larger mammals have headed up into higher elevation to escape the heat, to find more food, and it can just be more difficult in general to find wildlife to photograph. So when those summer months hit, I usually head out to the marsh. Not looking for ducks this time though. I love heading out into the marsh to look for waterfowl and shorebirds to photograph. Those summer months are some of my favorite times. They are my favorite times to photograph waterfowl and shorebirds. You get so many species that you're able to photograph in that beautiful summer morning light. You get species like American avocets, ibises, stilts, herons, egrets, sandpipers, just so many different species that are hanging around that you can photograph. And a lot of those species too, you get colors on them, their breeding plumage, that you don't get at other times of the year. American avocets, for example, they're so pretty as they take on those orangey colors, and then, you know, within just a few months later in the fall, they're all white and black again, which they're still beautiful to photograph, but when they have that orange color on them, so pretty. But those summer months, when you get a lot of those shorebirds coming in to these different areas where just months before it just had tons of ducks in there, the ducks are gone, but now you get the shorebirds, and it can be so much fun to photograph these different species of birds that come in. So summer months for me, that's when I tend to focus most on shorebirds and waterfowl. Such a wonderful time for this group of birds, these different species of birds. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there have been times as a wildlife photographer where I've just felt completely stuck, just not even knowing what to go out to look for because I don't know where it's going to be and when it's going to be there. But as I've come to understand animal behavior a little bit better, as I've come to understand migratory patterns of birds, all the things that we've talked about in this week's video, I found that it's become easier to find wildlife no matter what time of year it is. And I hope that this week's video has given you some ideas of some animals that you can find pretty consistently and pretty reliably no matter what time of year it is. I would love to hear from you guys. What are some of your go-to species that you love to just get out there and photograph during certain times of the year? What species do you look for during certain times of the year versus other times of the year? I would love to hear from you guys. Let me know in the comments below. I know the other viewers who go through those comments, they love learning from you as well, so don't be shy. Let me know in the comments below. On another note, I've now got my 2023 wildlife calendars available on my website. I'll put a link to them in the description below. I've got a variety of different species that I've been able to photograph throughout these different seasons of the year that we've been talking about in this week's video. I'd be forever grateful if you went and picked one up for yourself, or if you picked some up for your friends, your family members, your loved ones. Again, I've got a link to it in the description below. And thank you in advance for the support. I always appreciate it. It means so much to me. Thanks for following along this week's video. Stay safe out there, you guys. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.